It's time for us to check back in with John Rice, A People and Their Quilts. That's the book that we've been reading, and today is the last reading of the book. If you've missed any of the previous ones, though, just look in the description below for a playlist. The Morning Glory quilt above, which Julia Needum completed in 1982, won first place in the National Quilt Show in New Orleans in 1982 in the hand-pieced, hand-quilted category. The 7 Stars pattern shown below was chosen as the blue ribbon winner in hand-pieced, hand-quilted category in the National Quilt Show held in Arlington, Virginia in 1981. Julia's Drunkard's Path. One of Julia Needum's trademarks is her ability to use different fabrics in creating unusual and imaginative color designs in her quilts. The one shown here, her version of Drunkard's Path, won a special award at the 1983 Smoky Mountain Quilt Show in Oak Ridge for Best Use of Color and Design, presented by Mildred Lock's Quilter's Haven. Julia's husband, Boyce, is helping her hold the quilt, photographed by Ed Meyer. Julia Needum is shown here holding her trip around the world, her very first quilt made when she was 13. The blazing star is in the background. Julia Needum, National Prize winning quilter. Julia Overton Needum recalls that when she was 5 years old, living in Knoxville, Tennessee, her mother started to quilt during the revival of interest in quilting in those Depression years. She remembers punching the needle through the quilt and then having to crawl under the quilting frame to push it back. Like most quilters, Julia is exuberant when talking about her quilting. She puts it most succinctly when she says, "It just consumes you." Julia used this old pattern, Blazing Star, but set the stars inside squares created by the incorporation of what she calls streaks of lightning. I worked on this quilt for 6 or 7 months, Julia admits. I worked some every day. Some days I worked a lot longer than others, but I worked some every day. Didn't feel right if I didn't do something on it each day. It won Best of Show in the annual Smoky Mountain Quilt Competition in Oak Ridge in 1982, and it took first place in the hand-pieced and hand-quilted category in the Tennessee Valley Agriculture and Industry Fair in Knoxville. It won first place in the same category at another quilt show in Parson, Tennessee. I never had a lesson on quilting. My mother quilted a little bit, but it was just a flash in the pan with her. She wasn't in good health, and she never quilted much, but I was just excited to death with sewing and quilting ever since I can remember. When I was 13 or 14, I made this quilt that I'm holding in the picture, Trip Around the World. I set out in our front yard on Chapman Highway one summer under the shade tree and watched them make it into 4 lanes. That's when I quilted my first quilt by myself, made it out of dress scraps. I went to see the Stearns and Foster collection in Cincinnati in 1977, and that really fired me up. I really got inspired seeing all them beautiful quilts there, and I come home and started in earnest. Then I entered some quilts in the Smoky Mountain Quilt Show in Oak Ridge, and they really helped and encouraged me. I just always quilted on my own and never showed my quilts, so those women there were so encouraging and helpful, and that gave me another big push, and when I won Best of Show there, of course, that just excited me to death. I keep a quilt up just about all the time. I'm lost if I don't have a quilt set up to work on. The Bell Telephone Quilt. As a child, Lola Shelby Sweat often watched her mother make quilts at their home in the Alder Springs section of Campbell County, Tennessee. Although Lola learned to sew, she didn't take up quilting until many years later. One day while working at the Bell Telephone Company in La Follette, she noticed a doormat with the Bell emblem, and the thought immediately struck her, why doesn't somebody make a quilt using the telephone in it? Then I said, I'll make it myself. And so the Bell Telephone Quilt was conceived. Lola made the quilt and a pillow to match. The pillow won first place in its category in the 1983 Smoky Mountain Quilt Show in Oak Ridge, and the quilt won second place in its category. When I called Lola regarding the unusual quilt, she informed me that she had just completed her last day with the Bell Telephone Company after 30 years, 1 month, and a day. Photographed by the author. 4 and 20 Blackbirds. Jean Lester grew up in the atomic city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, married a Knoxville physician, and is the mother of 5 young children. I was curious about what sparked her interest in quilting, which she started in 1975. I wanted something to leave for the grandchildren I hope to have someday, something that I myself had made and created. My curiosity remained as to why she chose quilts for her grandchildren over 1,000 other items. I asked about her early childhood, whether she had been exposed in those formative years to sewing and or quilting. She told me of her childhood years on the plains of eastern Colorado. Her family had come to that wheat-growing region directly from the German section of Switzerland and were prodigious seamstresses. All my clothes were handmade back then, Jean recalls. She chose the 4 and 20 blackbirds ideal because she wanted excitement and movement, but it was her husband, Dr. Tom Lester, who actually drew the design which she quilted. It won first place in the category Hand Appliqued, Hand Quilted Crib Quilt in the 1983 Smoky Mountain Quilt Competition and Show, photographed by the author. The D.W. Prophet Commemorative Quilt. The March 3, 1983 edition of the Knoxville News Sentinel carried a colored photograph covering 1/4 of the entire front page. The photograph was not one of some great catastrophe, a notable celebrity, nor of a dramatic event, but rather it was a picture of a man and his quilt. The man was D.W. Prophet, 90-year-old founder of a chain of large department stores in East Tennessee. His employees wanted to commemorate the opening of his latest and largest store, so they got together and spent 3 months designing and making this commemorative quilt for their boss. The project was largely coordinated by Becky Cohen and Julia Martin of Prophet's advertising department, but it involved many other Prophet's employees and friends. The quilt blocks include a likeness of the entrepreneur, a church, musical instruments, and other symbols which represent significant aspects of Mr. Prophet's long life. Photograph taken by Barbara Maxwell, courtesy of Becky Cohen. Nat Winston is a psychiatrist and authority on mountain folk and early country music who serves as the master of ceremonies for the annual Museum of Appalachia homecoming each October. Nat and his wife Martha invited me to come by to look at some quilts they have and continue to use on the beds in their modern home. The one Martha holds belonged to her father, Walker Casey, and earlier to her grandparents, Andrew Jackson Casey and Linda Casey. The other quilt was given to Nat by his mother and came from the Swank family, which reportedly immigrated to East Tennessee from Maryland. Quilting bees have returned. The most popular activity at the Granger County, Tennessee Senior Center in Rutledge, according to Director Brenda Boggs, is quilting. The members quilt continuously, and the proceeds from the sale of the quilts go toward the operation of the center. The quilters are from left to right: Monty McElhaney, Minnie Brabeson, Ethel McElhaney, Vicki Capps, Axie Miller, and Rachel Welch. Flavel Patton's Whole Cloth Quilt. At the 1983 Smoky Mountain Quilt Show in Oak Ridge, many people admired a beautiful whole cloth quilt which had been awarded not only the Blue Ribbon Prize in the whole cloth category, but was also chosen as the judge's choice. Because it was made by a man, it created a stir of interest, and because he was a retired farmer and banker from rural Middle Tennessee, the visitors seemed even more surprised. Therefore, I called Flavel Patton at his home in McMinnville and asked him if there had been childhood experiences, as is almost always the case, which influenced his involvement with quilts. When I was a boy on a farm in the Jesse community of Warren County, it was my job to stay in the house of a morning and help my mother, who was in poor health. In the afternoon, I'd work in the fields, but in the mornings, I'd help Mother cook, can food, sew, quilt, and whatever she was doing. I learned to quilt, but after I left home, I never continued with it. But after I retired as a seed salesman and from 17 years as a banker, I started back to quilting. I began in 1978 and heard of Mildred Lock down here at Bell Buckle and went down there and took 3 courses from her. She introduced me to trapunto work and I became very interested in it. I made the design in this one myself and did the trapunto, stuffed it with yarn from behind, and it was displayed for 2 months during the World's Fair in Knoxville, and it won first place in the Oak Ridge Show. Quilting is a great pastime, and although I'm 76, I've got 3 or 4 in mind right now that I'm anxious to get started on. Photograph by the author. Mildred and Edgar Lock are shown here in front of their 1873 Bell Buckle, Tennessee home, holding what Mildred describes as her favorite quilt. If I could only have one quilt, this is the one that I'd choose, she unhesitatingly states. It is a mariner's compass in mint condition, and it was made in Middle Tennessee in 1855. Mildred Lock holds a quilt made by her grandmother in 1910. She is shown beside the pie safe with which her mother and father started housekeeping in 1911 and which is used to display a portion of the Lock's quilt collection. This photograph shows a corner of Mildred Lock's downstairs bedroom with a pine cone or pineapple quilt on the bed made near Mildred's home in Bedford County in the late 1800s. At the foot of the bed, and also shown reflected in the mirror, is an applique quilt which Mildred dates about 1860. The note attached to it reads, "Made by 6 sisters for their beloved brother on his wedding day." The quilt on the table is Kansas Dugout. The 3 quilts shown here were all made in Middle Tennessee. The Rose of Sharon on the bed was made in Marshall County and is signed Jane Chapman, 1855. The wall-hanging quilt is an unusual cross-stitch one made in Coffee County in the 1940s, and the princess feathers on the chair was made in Warren County, Tennessee, prior to 1845. Mildred Lock, the quilter's quilter. In my contacts with numerous young quilters, the name Mildred Lock kept turning up. As a matter of fact, several very fine quilters, sponsors of quilt shows and exhibits, gave credit to Mildred Lock for their interest in quilts. Many of those people concluded our discussions by saying, "You ought to talk with Mildred Lock down at Bell Buckle, Tennessee." When I discovered that the National Quilt Show was being held at Bell Buckle because of Mildred, I made it a point to visit her. Bell Buckle, located in the very heart of the area which spawned the world-famous Tennessee walking horses, is located in Middle Tennessee, about 65 miles southeast of Nashville. It was named, so Mildred has always been told, after a cowbell and a buckle which was found carved on a tree in that area. Ostensibly, this carving was placed there by a scout to indicate the site for a group of settlers to stop and graze their livestock. Mildred and her husband have built a small building at their back door for her quilt shop, and here she has a wide assortment of quilting material and supplies as well as new and used quilts. Inside their home, everything says quilts. There were quilts on all the beds as spreads, and there were quilts hanging on the walls, on the chairs and couches, as tablecloths, and even one hanging as a shower curtain. Mildred advocates using quilts as opposed to keeping them stored in climate-controlled areas, never or seldom seen. She loves them, cares for them carefully, and even, I think, talks to them. That is why she wants them with her wherever she is. Mildred, the obvious question would be how you became interested in quilts and quilting. So many people across the state indicated that they were influenced by you. To what do you attribute their interest? Does it go back to your childhood? Yes, it goes back that far. I love the quilts. I love the patterns. I love the designs. But we had what we called country quilts. I can remember folding the Sears and Roebuck catalog for my mother to make squares. She'd make the top, and she'd put it in the frame, and my aunts would come and they would quilt. And they could make a quilt in a day because they did it in the fan, and they did it fast, and it didn't take that long. But that quilt was to keep us warm. I didn't like those quilts. I liked the fancy quilts that had the beautiful feathered designs quilted on them, and those that had the beautiful applique, the ones we always kept for company. We didn't ever get to use those things. I was the one that went into the front bedroom and would trace that pattern with my finger, you know, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make quilts like that. I didn't make quilts until we moved back here in 1960, but in the back of my mind, that longing was always there. You indicated that your aunts would come in to quilt. Yes, it was a quilting bee. They would come and would quilt all day long. It would be my mother, her sister, and her sister-in-law. There were about 5 of them would quilt together. This was mainly during the winter. When I was 12 or so, I made me a navy blue shirt, and I was going to work my buttonholes with white thread. Well, I sat right beside Grandma, and every white thread had to be exactly the same length, you know. That buttonhole was perfect when I got through. I worked about 7 down the front of that shirt. And from then on, I thought, I won't let Grandma see me do anything. I remember that more than anything. If you're going to do it right. And that was your father's mother? Yes, she was a perfectionist, and she saw to it that I did it perfect also. I always had sewn since I was 6 years old or so. My mother always let me use her sewing machine, and I appreciate that too, that she let me do it. I did what I wanted to, and I sewed. When I was a little girl, 7 or 8, and had a dime and went to town, I would buy these dresser sets to embroidery, you know, instead of a toy, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do needlework. I've done every kind of needlework, but when we moved back here in 1960 to stay and take care of my mother, you know, I thought to myself, I can quilt now. I have the time. So that's when I started quilting. I started trying to quilt, let us say. The first I did was a cross-stitch quilt, blue cross-stitch quilt. I didn't know how to quilt. I'd seen my mother do it, you know, and the cross-stitch quilt had all these dots on there. I remember when I took it out of the package, I'd ordered it as a kit, and I said, I knew I was going to do all the little X's, but I said, if you think I'm going to put a needle and all those little dots all over this quilt, you're mistaken. That's what I told the quilt. But after I got it cross-stitched, then I wanted to quilt it. And so I borrowed some quilting frames, but Edgar doesn't like for me to borrow anything. He likes for me to have my own. So he went to a sale and he bought me some old-fashioned quilting frames. Well, the only place I could put them up was upstairs, so we put them up in the north room upstairs, and I would go up there and I would quilt. I knew I was not doing what I should do. I was not doing the right thing. It didn't look right, and I couldn't decide if you made your thread to go from this dot to that dot, or whether you went through the middle, or what. All during that quilt, I did all sorts of different kinds of work, trying to do what I knew I should be doing, but I never was satisfied with what I did on that quilt. I finished it and bound it, and started another one. Was this the first one you made on your own? Yes, but the quilting designs on the kits are gorgeous, you know. They have those feather wreaths, and that's what got me hooked. As soon as I quilted one feather wreath, I knew I was going to quilt a lot of those, you know, because they're real pretty. But my quilting didn't look right. So I was sitting in there on the couch quilting a pill cushion on a little quilt-as-you-go frame, and this lady from Bell Buckle came out. Her name is Bess Arnold. She came out and she says, Mildred, you're not doing that right. She took that needle and she sat the thimble back at the back of that needle and she started this little stitch just like that. That was just like an electric light came on, and I knew that was the way Mama and my aunts had quilted all that time. When I teach it, they have to teach their fingers to do that, but I didn't have to learn it like that because I'd been searching for it. I was so excited. My husband was working then. He'd come home at midnight. Well, I was still quilting at midnight, but I didn't even go to bed then. I just kept on quilting because I had found what I wanted to know. I'm not sure I understand that technique. I know, it's something you have to be shown. See, what I did to that first quilt was I sewed it together. I sewed my 3 layers together. But quilting is a stitch. You were talking about the 3-dimensional look. It gives you that 3-dimensional look. A lot of women are sewing instead of quilting, and there's a big difference. Now, Miss Clemmy Simmons in Shelbyville gave me a lot of hints about quilting. I'd go to her and I'd talk to her, you know, and she'd show me things and gave me a lot of hints about it. I read every book I could get too. But books, people think if it's written in a book, it's right, but that's not true. I bought this book written by a lady in Alabama, and I had done everything that it said to do to make a log cabin block, and I couldn't come out with this block. I told Edgar, I said, we're going to Linville, Alabama. When I say we're going somewhere, he says, okay, you know. So we went to Linville, Alabama to see this lady who had made this log cabin block, quilt as you go pattern in this book. I went to see her and I said to her, I've done step by step, over and over, exactly what you say to do. When I get through, this is not on this block exactly right. She said, oh, you just cut that background block just a little larger, then you trim it off when you get through. So I knew then that you use your common sense. Here in the Lock home, the quilt on the bed is commonly known as the New York Beauty. It is also called Crown of Thorns and Rocky Mountain Road. It was made near Bell Buckle about 1900. The quilt draped on the table is a variation of the Star and Compass circa 1930. There's more to making a quilt than quilting, Mildred points out as she makes preparation to start her next one. Since the world-famous Tennessee walking horse breed was developed inside of Mildred's home, it is not surprising to find a walking horse symbol for a wall-hanging quilt square. This quilt square is a classic example of a design known by several names: monkey wrench, Virginia reel, Indiana puzzle, and snail trail. Mildred is shown holding what she believes to be the oldest quilt in their collection. It is called Sunburst and was made in Atlanta and traded by the maker to a grocery man for food during the Civil War. Mildred, I think we were trying to determine how you became such a national influence on quilting, and we started out with your mother and your aunts that would come in and help quilt, etc. What happened after you made the first one, and how did you get into the business? Well, after I made that cross-stitch quilt, then I wanted to make a pieced quilt. I'd always wanted to make a Lone Star, so I made a yellow Lone Star, yellow and brown Lone Star. I made a lot of quilts. Then my son got ready to get married, and I made him a quilt. I was making quilts, and I was enjoying quilts, and I was having a good time. Then it got to where other people were interested in quilts. Were you selling some of yours? No, I wasn't selling any at all. When I finally started selling quilts, a friend of mine called me and asked me to go on the tour of homes at the Pilgrimage in Natchez, Mississippi. Well, by then, my mother lived until 1964, and my father lived until 71, and all the time in there I was just making things for us. It was after this that she said, let's go to this pilgrimage in Natchez. That was in October, before the pilgrimage was in the next March. I got to thinking, I'd always worked and always had my own money, and I thought I'd like to earn my money to spend down there. Of course, Edgar would gladly given it to me, you know. I could have gone without that, but I liked having my own money. I thought I'd make a quilt and sell it so I'd have some money. I was making a Lone Star at the time, so when I let people know, I just told a person or two that I would sell a quilt. They come out here, and I was working on a Lone Star, so they'd want a Lone Star. I had the process down pat, so I could make a Lone Star fairly quick. And I guess, I don't know how many I made, but made plenty of money to take with me to Natchez, and that's when I started. But while I was doing that, people would come here and they would ask me questions, or they'd call me and they would ask me things when they realized I knew about quilting. A lot of people were getting interested in quilting. That was in the mid-70s. See, I had to take care of Mother and Daddy, and I did that. We farmed and had gardens and did all that, you know. So I was just doing my sewing as I could. So finally, there was so much interest in quilting that I decided I would have a quilting class. I put a little ad in the paper and said I wanted 6 students. Well, I got 7, and I taught around my kitchen table in there. Before I got through with that quilting class, I realized they needed a place to get their supplies. If I told them to get a quilting hoop, they couldn't get them in Shelbyville, or quilting needles. They couldn't get what they needed. So I told Edgar, I said, you know, if you sit and quilt, you have a lot of time to think. And as I said, he worked at night. He was gone, and I had from 2 o'clock in the afternoon till midnight to think. He'd come home, and I would have quilted all that time, and he would say, who'd you talk to? Well, I'd think, and maybe I hadn't talked to anybody. But if you're quilting, you don't miss them. You know, you're satisfied. But I thought we need a quilting supply shop. So we decided that the room you came in by out there had an outside entrance, and we had the freezer, and you know you have to have a junk room, so that was the junk room. I said, why can't we clean that out and have a quilter supply shop? And he said we could, so we cleaned it out and had a yard sale and sold our junk and made enough to fix up the room nice to put a shop in it. We started trying to find suppliers. You know, at that time in '74, there was nowhere that you could go and buy these supplies. So like when I got ready for my round frames, we went to Canton, Ohio to the factory and talked to the president of the company and made arrangements to get it. When I needed my batting, we went to Cincinnati and to Mountain Mist and made arrangements with them. We went to the source. So now we still order direct from the factory, and they know me and I know them, and it works out real well to do that. Since then, there are people you can order all your supplies from one place if you want to. Needles, thread, quilting thread. I wanted all white because we wanted to work in muslin. We wanted to make country looking things. Well, they kept telling me that nobody would use anything but white. I also wanted some colors, because if you're doing a dark brown, you don't want to quilt with white on that. I don't. I want some brown thread on there. That's another thing. That's the way you date quilts. In about 1870, the whole cloth quilt became popular. You quilted just the fabric in the color, and all you got was the quilting design. You know, it wasn't pieced. Well, everybody couldn't afford to buy the fabric to make them a whole cloth quilt, so then they started quilting their quilts with the color thread that the lining was, which was usually white or off-white. Then on Sunday, they turned the quilt over and it looked like they had a whole cloth quilt. So when you see a quilt that was quilted with colored thread on the back, you can pretty well say that it was before 1870. That's one way of dating quilts. But then when I got into quilting, people who had quilted that I talked to said, "Oh, you don't ever have colored thread on the back of your quilt." I started looking for colors in quilting thread. Well, I just had to insist to the manufacturers that we did want colored thread. So now you can buy colored quilting thread. When you started teaching, you said that you had your first class and you had 7 students. How long did you continue, or are you still teaching quilting? I still teach quilting. I'll always teach quilting as long as I can talk, I guess. I've been teaching Monday through Thursday, morning and night each day. I try to keep the number of students to 8, but I've had as many as 10. I have retreats now. People come and stay at the War Trace Hotel, and they come here for 3 days of concentrated lessons. They come from everywhere. Now my group that's coming in in June, the 19th of June, I don't know any of those ladies. I've never met any of them. They're coming here to study quilting. Most of your students, I suppose, have some knowledge of sewing, don't they? How do you go about it? Most of them do. Once in a while I have somebody to come who has never sewn, and do you know, they're real easy to teach. I don't have to break them of any bad habits. They do exactly what I tell them to do. I'm a technique teacher in the beginning class. They get no choice about pattern, fabric, or anything. I teach them technique. If you have a good foundation, then you can go with your colors, your designs, etc. But I'm a firm believer in a good foundation. Well, just like I was saying out there, I make them think of a different way to set their quilt. I won't let them look at a quilt and copy it. Many of my former students have taken all my courses, and then they have started teaching quilting themselves. And then quite a few of them have opened their own shops. Allison Arnold was one of my students. My students have shops in Clarksville, Hendersonville, Pegram, and Pulaski. Well, there's apparently a lot more interest in quilting now than there ever has been, isn't there? It's more public than it's ever been. In 1976, I went to my first big quilt show, which was in Warren, Michigan. Edgar and I went up there, and oh, that was a treat. Quilts hanging from the ceiling of the gymnasium, and we stayed 3 days and looked at quilts. Well, the next year, they had a quilt symposium in Lincoln, Nebraska. My daughter was working with me, and she and I went to that quilt symposium. Well, that was as near heaven as I'll ever expect to get on earth, you know. There we were with over 500 people. See, I had no idea that there were that many people in the world that were interested in quilting, but there we were, all interested in exactly the same thing, hearing lectures, and it was just fantastic. Until just this past few years, it would usually be only me and my daughter, you know, but we finally formed the Tennessee Valley Quilters Association, so I've gotten others going too. I think that there will never be an end to it. Well, of course, there never has been an end to it. You indicated a while ago that you did the gardening. Nearly every quilter that I've ever met, it seems, enjoys gardening almost as much as quilting. I don't think I've ever seen one that didn't. Well, we gardened a lot. I froze vegetables, I canned vegetables, but now I feel like I've done that. I don't do it anymore. That era of my life is gone. Well, I have a question I always ask quilters. What is there about quilting that you find so enjoyable? Sitting there for hours, it seems to me, could be the most tiring and boring thing in the world. Just like I said, I would quilt from 2 o'clock in the afternoon until my husband came home at midnight and not even realize that I had not spoken to a soul. I was happy. I couldn't have been any happier than I was. You can crochet, knit, do needlepoint, you can do embroidery. I've done them all. It's not the same. Quilting, you feel a kinship with all of your ancestors. When you quilt, the first quilt that we quilted was one that my grandmother Williams had made for my sister in 1925. Well, when I worked on that quilt, I was with Grandma. One lady brought a quilt top here that she wanted quilted. She was on her way home from Nashville, and this quilt top had been handed down from mother to daughter for 3 generations under the condition that she would get it quilted. Well, she was the 3rd one to inherit this quilt, and she said, "I'm not taking it to my house and putting it away. I want this quilt quilted. My great-great-grandmother made it, and she wanted it quilted." In that sack was her little metal template that she had drawn around, just like I teach my students to do. Just as perfect. She had drawn around each one of those. There were her pieces. There was her yard that she had saved for her binding, like I try to get my students to do, to take this extra yard of binding so that if you don't quilt it for 6 years, you'll have your binding. And there was her binding. Well, I felt as close to that woman. Yes, I guess there is nothing more revealing than to see something that someone has done with their hands and you know what they were thinking. It really does create a kinship. Yes, it does. And the old quilts, your heart just goes out to them. Where did you quilt when you were here? Which room of the house did you use? That room in there was a bedroom, which is our living room now. That was the room we used. But I can remember, too, that the quilt hung here. We had a fire in the fireplace, and it hung from the ceiling there, and they'd pull it up at night, you know. Is there anything else that you can think of that I should ask you about quilting? I could talk from now to eternity about quilts. We were talking about the use of quilts and how there's a difference of opinion as to whether or not a beautiful old quilt should be used. The sentiments that my grandmother had was that the fine quilts should be packed away and never used. My daughter comes along and puts them on the bed and says, "What good are they if you can't use them?" You're somewhere in between on that, I think, aren't you? I'm going to take care of them, but I'm not going to have them packed away. If I don't see them, I can't enjoy them. I had my quilts in a trunk, and we spent many happy hours looking for a chest that we could display them in, so at least I can see this much of them. It so happened that my pie safe that my mother and daddy started housekeeping with is what I have them in, you know. We had it out there on the back porch, and I asked my husband, I said, "Will you move that in there in the bedroom for me?" I just knew it wouldn't do, you know, but I said, "Move it in there and see." The minute he sat it there, I knew that's what I wanted there. And it pleases me that my quilts are in my mother and daddy's pie safe. Then you don't have any quilts at all that you don't use, even your Baltimore quilt? See the one there on the back of that chair, the basket quilt? That's just where it lives. It lives there. It may fall to pieces there, you know, but that's all right because I see it every morning when I come out of the bedroom and it makes me happy. So what's important? Just make up your mind, and really the next generation may not enjoy these. This is beautiful country, but it doesn't seem like the kind of place you'd expect to have the National Quilt Show. How did it come about that the show is going to be held here this year? I had been going to the National Quilt Show for several years in the big cities. I felt like everybody would enjoy Bell Buckle, which is entirely different from what they had seen. I thought we had a lot to offer. Bell Buckle is an arts and crafts town. We have the facilities here at Webb School, and I couldn't see any reason why it couldn't be held in Bell Buckle as well as a big city. It's usually been held in the Washington, D.C. area, and once in New Orleans, and once in Fort Wayne, Indiana. A lot of people are coming to the show, busloads are coming, and everybody seems excited about it being here in Bell Buckle. Quilt squares and contemporary art. The noted potter, artist, and ceramist Douglas J. Ferguson was commissioned by Mars Hill College in North Carolina to design and build a large centerpiece-type fountain near an impressive structure which was then under construction, Blackwell Hall. Doug wanted to give the college a significant piece of art, one that would complement the building, and he wanted to create a youthful and springtime feeling. In order to accomplish this, in what is perhaps his most significant single work, he chose old quilt patterns for the design. Each side of the art structure contains dozens of familiar quilt squares. Doug describes his work as follows. The rendition of these quilting squares was the greatest challenge to me. I wanted to give new meaning and new feeling to these old designs without losing the excellent quality they had already attained. The use of relief and decorative textures with subtle color tones on the tiles and the use of a vibrant blue suggests the youthful gaiety of the campus. The extensive use of white represents freedom and innocence. Doug was born in the community of Possum Trot in Yancey County, North Carolina, and as a child remembers watching his mother make quilts, employing many of the colorful and artistic patterns which he would later use in his ceramic art. He graduated from Mars Hill College with a major in art and later worked in the Ceramic Research Laboratory for the Tennessee Valley Authority in Norris, Tennessee. He and his father-in-law, Ernest Wilson, founded the now well-known Pigeon Forge Pottery in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. And that is the end of our book. Really nice way to end it. I loved Mildred Lock, the part about her, but then kind of ending it with that contemporary art there that the gentleman had made at Mars Hill College. Makes me wonder if it's still there. I wonder if you know, you could share in the comments. Anyway, really interesting end to the book. It's been a good book. Interesting to see all the different quilt patterns, which I'm not a quilter. I can't even hardly sew on a button, so that part not as much to me as all the stories, but still beautiful, beautiful quilts and all the stories that go with the quilts and all the stories that have been shared by the people that we've learned about from John Rice. That first one, Julia Needum, that we talked about, she was just crazy about quilting, wasn't she? A lot of them were. Mildred Lock was too, and a lot of the others. But Julia was really interesting that she, that she had, from an early age, she had just been really, really interested in the quilts, and even to the point that when she got to have some extra spending money, she didn't buy candy or something like I would have done. Bought me a little 45 record at Sky City. She wanted to buy something that she would actually use with needlework. And she had some really beautiful quilts, and I really loved that part about when she finally entered the quilt in the quilt show, how all those ladies really encouraged her and told her she's doing a good job, and that just should lit a fire under her and just give her more encouragement to continue to quilt. The next lady one of the ladies after that he talked to, Lola, or that he shared in the book. I don't know the order of how he talked to him, of course, but anyway, Lola, the telephone quilt, that's interesting. I would have never thought about making a telephone quilt with the emblem there of the telephone company, but she thought about it and then she did it, so that was neat. Neat too that they talked about a little bit about the quilting bee. Of course, that's been mentioned all through this, and if you remember in one of those first readings that we read about, John Rice kind of debated about whether the quilting bee was really as widespread as people said it was. And he kind of thought that maybe it was more like what Mildred was sharing, that it was just on a much smaller scale. Like she said, it was her mother and her mother's sister and her sister-in-law, and maybe one or two other people, maybe their mother or something. Or if it was that community affair, But then there was a photo shared in this part of it being at a community center and everybody coming together for the quilting bee, and said it was just continuous. It just went on and on and on and on. That's wonderful, that sense of community, that sense of gathering to create something. Of course, the proceeds were going to help the center. So all that's really interesting, really wonderful. As I said, I'm not a quilter and don't know anything about it much at all when it comes to actually the techniques and things. I did have a dear friend that was a quilter, and I remember at one point she had like an online quilting bee. So you think, well, how do you do that? Well, they mailed the squares through the mail, so that was really an interesting concept. I remember thinking, like, wonder what all those ladies in the past would think about this. And I'm pretty sure, I don't remember if we read it in this book or if I've read it somewhere else, that at some point there was kind of that same thing going on, but instead of course, sharing about it on the internet, it was just still mailing them, but it was just, handwritten notes like, here's a square, put it in your quilt, or, I want to contribute this to the quilt you're making. So really neat when you think about it reaching outside the community or outside the family. Mildred Lock, you can kind of see why he used her for the very last part of the book. She loved quilting. I'm not saying she loved it any more than any of the other people that we read about today or even in the past, but she really loved it. But neat that she influenced so many people. Once she learned and got her knowledge, then she influenced other people. And then they went on to influence other people. And interesting how she ended up even selling this stuff. All those beautiful old quilts, amazing that she'd collected all of them. And I really loved the one that had the little note that the six sisters had made it for their brother. So special, but all of them really special when you think about them. And John Rice, in kind of describing how much Mildred loved quilting, he said he was even sure she talked to them. She talked to them. Reminds me, he was talking about the garden, and reminds me of people that talk to their plants, and encourage their plants. So just a really great love that she had for the quilts. And interesting, way back, very first reading I think it was, or at least the second one, if not the first one, he talked about whether should you use the quilts, should you put them up. There's different ways of looking at it. One way is if all those people had used them, there wouldn't be any of them left for us to look at it today because they'd just be wore out. It's one way to look at it. But then I really like her way of looking at it, that if you enjoy them that much and they're just stuck somewhere in a chest where you never see them, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. You don't even think about them. But like the one that she had laying on the back of her chair there that she described, every day she said, when I come out of the room, it's the first thing I see in the morning. That's just really precious thinking about that. And as she said, you think, well, you're saving them for the future generations. What if they don't even care about them? What if they don't, what if they don't like them? So interesting, her outlook on that. The part she mentioned about the cross stitch and the little patterns that was on it. And then I think it was Julia Needum mentioned that too. As soon as I read those parts, my mind just remembered, like I cross-stitched some when I was a young girl too. Granny would let me do that. And I just remembered those little blue squares and the little dots. I've not cross-stitched in years. Probably somewhere I still have some of the things that I cross-stitched. And I was not very good at it, and I wasn't very neat. The front might look okay, then you turn it over on the back, and it was just this gom of different threads going every way. But I just suddenly remembered the excitement of pulling that out of the package and then seeing those little squares in the direction. So I really enjoyed that part. Edgar, boy, he was sweet, wasn't he? Mildred's husband. They just made a good pair. But her saying, she just says where she wants to go, and he says, let's go. And whatever she wanted to do, like she wanted to start selling this stuff, he said, let's clean the room out and we'll do it. And I really loved that. That was really, really sweet, and reminded me of me and Matt. Matt's always up for whatever I say, and whatever I want to do, he's always willing to help me figure it out and figure out how to do it. Really sweet too when Mildred, he's asked every one of these ladies that he talked to in depth, like, why quilting, and basically they've all said the same thing. How could there be anything else better than quilting? Could there be anything else better? It's the best. It's wonderful. Really touching to me, though, when she talked about how she would quilt till midnight, till Edgar got off work and come home. But also how that she would go all that time and not talk to nobody, but not even miss it. How it just kept her company. It so reminds me of Granny. You've probably heard her if you watch our videos, and some of the videos say it, that after Pap died, and she's always liked to crochet, but after Pap died, she don't know what she would have done without crochet. That it just give her something to put her mind on and to think about, and not to just sit there and think about missing him, and that it just really saved her and kept her company. In her recent hospital stay, she told a lot of the nurses that she needed to get back home and get to her crocheting. And of course, we did offer to bring her crocheting to her there in the hospital, but she just didn't feel up to it. And she had some reaction to a medicine that made her hands swell, and then after that peel, and so she wouldn't have been able to do it anyway, probably without the thread catching on her rough skin. Her hands will have to get back in shape. But that was just really sweet that Mildred talked about that too. And of course, it doesn't have to be quilting or crocheting or hand stuff. It can be anything. All of us, there's different things we enjoy like that, us humans. Maybe it's, being outdoors. Maybe it's gardening. I love to garden, and is my place like that where it takes my mind off things. I'm a big reader, so I like to read. I can lose myself in a book, but I really thought that was sweet. So I really enjoyed this whole book. I've enjoyed this ending part, but I enjoyed all of it more than I thought I would, I think. I knew that a lot of you were quilters, so you would enjoy it, but I've really enjoyed it more than that. Now, it might be because he wasn't as technical about how to do things and stuff, so he was telling more of the story, A People and Their Quilt. That was the name of the book, so telling more of the overarching story that runs through it. That was another thing that was really sweet that she explained, was like those people that are working in an old quilt, that's almost like you're there with that person that made it, that is bringing that continuation of your family, or your family, or maybe you found one in a thrift store or something, you're going to finish it, but it's that person that started it. It's kind of like you're there with them while they're doing it. That's really very touching. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this book. I hope you'll leave a comment about what you enjoyed in this last reading. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday. I've already got another book picked out for us, and I think it's one that we'll all really, really enjoy.